starting today, we're going to do our very last unit, which is sign language. We're going to focus on American Sign Language, which is used by most signers in the United States. Note that sign languages vary from country to country, just like spoken languages do. So someone signing in American Sign Language is not intelligible to someone signing in British Sign Language. They're different languages. Even though British English and American English are related, American Sign Language and British Sign Language are not related. They're separate languages. And sign language, just like spoken language, has regional variation. So we'll see an example in a little bit of how people just 100 miles apart might use completely different signs, just like people 100 miles apart who use spoken language might use different words for the same thing, like sofa or couch, and mean something else, or the curb or the berm, or some people talk about soda, some people talk about pop, some people talk about soda pop, some people talk about Coke, right? Same thing in sign language, people have different words for the same thing, and you have to know that those mean the same thing in order to understand what they're saying. Sign language is distinct from other kinds of communicative gestures like pantomime for a number of different reasons. Signs are organized into lexical categories, just like words are, spoken words. And it's tricky to talk about sign language because the language of language has been defined in terms of spoken language. So when I talk about words, if I'm talking about sign language, a word is a sign, right? Or a morpheme is a sign, or a phoneme is a sign, or part of a sign. And it sounds weird to talk about things that are happening without sound using terms that were based on sound. But because the linguistics started off focusing on spoken language, a lot of the words we use still have those sound-based biases. And we don't have other words yet, in all cases, to capture those distinctions. So when I talk about signing, and I talk about people making signs, I'm talking about gestures, but I'm talking about gestures that have linguistic meaning, specific linguistic meaning, just like spoken language would. Sign languages, unlike pantomime, have complete phonological systems, morphological systems. So there are allophones and allomorphs, and there are rules for how you connect things depending on the kind of noun or the kind of verb or the kind of preposition. Word order, there's a very clear syntax, and there are rules at every level of language processing that we've talked about with spoken language in sign language too. Sign languages have syllabic structure, so the way that we put words together when we're trying to organize different stress patterns, organize what we're going to emphasize, what we're not. If we're going to make a phonological word like jeet yet and kind of smush stuff together, and people are going to pull it back apart and figure out that we meant did you eat yet. You can do that in sign language too, but you have to be good at it, just like if you said to a non-native English speaker, jeet yet, they'd look at you like, what are you talking about? Like, I don't even know what you just said. So if you're not good at sign language, you won't be able to do the kinds of extractions. You don't have the top-down knowledge necessary to do those extractions. You might not realize that that's what they're doing. We can show, if we scan the brain, that if someone is signing, their brain is acting like they're talking. If someone's doing pantomime, their brain is acting like they're moving. So the brains of people who are just acting out something, like playing charades, are doing something different, even if you're trying to express a meaning with your gesture. If you go, right, when you're playing charades, right, everyone goes, oh, it's a movie, right, or, it's a book, right? And sometimes, people who are doing that, well, if we look at the brains of people who are doing those kinds of meaningful gestures, their brain's like, you're moving, okay? You're moving around, and maybe there's some imagery in your head of what you're trying to express. but it's very different than what's happening in the brains of people who are signing. When people who speak sign language sign, the parts of the left hemisphere that light up when you and I speak English light up for them. And this includes parts of the brain you might not expect to be involved in signing, like parts of the temporal lobe that are normally associated with auditory processing. People who use a manual language use the same parts of their brain to process their language as people who use spoken language. And even if that doesn't seem like it makes sense sometimes, the human brain parts that are designed for language process language regardless of what it is. And in some cases, people who are, for example, totally deaf, so they don't really have any need for their auditory cortex to do sound-based stuff, their brains will actually adopt that auditory cortex for visual processing so they can process more visual information, because it's more important for them to process it since they're not taking in auditory information. And we can see that if people who sign experience brain damage in the left hemisphere, they have similar kinds of problems in their speaking as people who experience brain damage in the left hemisphere who have an oral language. So the same kinds of problems, aphasia and other stuff like that, affects sign language the same way it affects spoken language. So sign languages work just like spoken languages, they just have a different modality. Now there are some areas in the brain that are active during signing that are not active in spoken language, and these include parts of the right hemisphere that are involved in processing spatial information, and that's because spatial information is very important when you're processing sign language. You have to pay attention not to things like pitch and tone and stuff like that, but you have to pay attention to where in space the person is signing, because that's informative. And so parts of the right hemisphere are also tied in to processing language with sign language that are not typically active when people are speaking in oral language. So let me show you, I think this bit is pretty cool. Now when we talk about sign language phonology, that sounds really strange, right? Because you think about phonology being the study of sound. But the term is being used here, extrapolated from the linguistics. Oh, got that. Very excited. Where is it now?
My name is Dr. Martin Osbrook.
No, it's not. Well, maybe it is, but we're not talking right now. Okay. So when we talk about sign language phonology, we're going to break it down into slightly different kinds of features. Now, when we talk about phonemes and phonology in spoken language, we talk about features like place of articulation, manner of articulation, and voicing. And there are places of articulation and manners of articulation in sign language, but they break down into more identifiable categories. So we don't just talk, there aren't things like stops and fricatives and things like bilabial and glottal and stuff like that. Instead, we talk about what are called parameters. We talk about things like handshape, the location in space where the sign is made, the movement made as the sign is being performed, the direction of the palm relative to the speaker, and other non-manual markers, things like what is your face doing, what are your shoulders doing, what are your arms doing. All of these things add to the nature of a sign. I'm going to show you some examples of these different features so you can get a sense of what we're talking about. If I say bilabial and tell you it's with two lips, you can do that. You make bilabial sounds all the time. But if you're not familiar with sign language, you might not know what some of these parameters are about. And the reason that we talk about these parameters as part of sign language phonology, or phonetics and phonology, is because in sign language there are minimal pairs that are distinguished by these features. So you'll recall that a minimal pair is a pair of words that are distinguished by a single phoneme. So for example, pat and bat. The fact that pat and bat are two different words in English tells us that p and b are unique sounds in English. That's how we decide what counts as a phoneme. Well, in sign language, it's possible to change just the hand shape, or just the location, or just the movement, or just the palm orientation, or just the non-manual markers, and change what word you're saying. Everything else can be the same. You change one of those features, and all of a sudden you're making a different word. So let me show you some examples here.
Dr. Dona, a few years back, if you remember the World Cup being in South Africa, like they televised that, but how did they, like, American Sign Language, like Americans can't read that because if it was in a different dialect.
They can't. They have to have, when it was broadcast in the United States, they would have to have someone. They'd have to have someone come in and actually sign it in American Sign Language. So that's why sometimes at large international events, you'll actually see 5 or 6 signers, 7, a bunch of signers up in the front of the room, because each one of them is actually speaking a different language. And we don't, if you don't speak any sign languages, then you don't know. But that's why at for example, a large political event, you might see lots and lots of different signers if the expectation is that there are going to be people speaking a lot of different languages there. Okay, so for example, we talk about hand shapes. Okay? Now you might have learned American Sign Language and learned how to finger spell. Did you ever learn how to do that? A, B, C, D, E, right, so forth. Okay, so all of those represent legitimate hand shapes. But you can talk about whether your hand is closed, whether it's open, whether fingers are spread, okay? If fingers are curved, some are curved, for example. So these are all distinct hand shapes that can be used, just like all the different places of articulation and manners of articulation we can use in American Sign Language. You can use extensions of different fingers and so forth to make different signs. So hand shapes are really all the different ways that the hand can be bent and curved in order to create a visually distinctive shape so that someone can use it for the purposes of a sign. Now, it's not just hand shape alone that's important, but there are other characteristics. For example, and we talk about location, movement. I'm going to show you some things about these manual markers, because it's hard to imagine. You can imagine that it might matter where in space you make a sign. So for example, if I make a sign up here, or I make a sign down here, that can change the meaning. If I make a sign out here, make a sign close to my body, that can change the meaning. Movements can vary, and you can just have, for example, you can make a sign and just hold it, or you can tap, or you can rub, and all of those mean something different. Let me show you the non-manual markers, because these are really cool.
It's a blessing that
You would use the full range of your voice. And if you don't use your face, and you don't use your body to make the sounds, and you're just kind of signing like this, again, it's like you have some kind of weird accent. So going like this, to mean near, is not the same thing as those. One looks more like you know what you're talking about, and the other one looks like you looked it up in a book or something like that, and you kind of don't get it. So without the non-manual markers, it doesn't quite look right. Here's a while back when Hurricane Sandy hit New York City. See if we can get this to run. The videos are not being my friend today, which is is really hard in a lecture on American Sign Language because you guys kind of need them.
Oh, that's what it was. It was the Mandela Memorial thing that I was thinking of, not the, oh, okay.
Why is being so difficult? Okay, do it now? Do it now. Today it's like, all semester I show videos and have no trouble. They update the computer over the break and now it won't do anything I want it to do. Okay, let's try this again.
You can hit X for this one and then try the other video if that's already loaded.
I can try. Oh, great, the advertisement for 15 seconds. This is your tech dollars at work.
Hey, guess what day it is?
Update! So those non-manual words, I think it's interesting because no one would ever ask someone who was speaking another language why they were changing their intonation and pitch. Right? Why are you so expressive? Because I'm talking, and because, you know, if I'm saying a question, I'm going to say, so, what are you guys doing? You know, I'm going to change the way my voice sounds, but people who are signing have to convert that into something visual that people can see, right? I just think it's funny. What's that all about? Oh, it's a mystery, you know. Obviously, I'm just using what's available to me to communicate the wide variety of things that human beings think about. You know, it's just a different way to do it. We just don't think about it if we've never used a visual language. We don't think about how important it is to utilize these other types of non-manual markers. People who aren't familiar with sign languages mostly just think that signs are just what's happening with the hands, and that's like saying all that's happening with language is what's happening with your mouth. And there's a lot of other stuff going on with your whole body when you're talking. That's also very important. Now, I wanted to show you some examples of minimal pairs, but this wonderfully updated computer, that's why I check the videos when I come into the room, is not running QuickTime movies right now. So I'm going to see if I can find another version of those or burn them into another format so that I can bring them and show you next time. But we do have minimal pairs in American Sign Language so that you can see kind of how just small changes in features change the meaning of words. And I want to note that Handshape as a feature is perceived categorically, just like things like place of articulation and manner of articulation are perceived categorically in spoken language. Not all of these parameters are perceived categorically, but we do have scientific evidence that Handshape is perceived categorically by speakers of sign languages. So their brain is processing it like it's a sound-based feature in our minds. Let's talk a little bit about sign language morphology. Okay, how do you build words in sign? In sign language, you can actually change the category of a word. So you can take a word that is a noun, like plain, and you can turn it into a verb by changing the motion. So one thing that people do to change the lexical categories of words or to inflect them, to indicate that there's more than one, to indicate possessive, things like that, is they will change some dimension of the sign. So you're literally signing things like, you know, you might say, you're binding these inflections to the words just like bound morphemes. Okay, so they have free morphemes and bound morphemes just like spoken language, but those bound morphemes might be reflected in a change in motion or a change in hand shape or a change in location. And when you produce the sign in a different location, you produce the sign with a slightly different hand shape, you produce the sign with a different movement, you're engaging in you're inflecting. You're basically adding a bound morpheme to the free morpheme and telling someone that now it's not just fly, but flying right now, for example. When signers watch other people signing, their brain processes the different parameters separately. Okay, so they process the free morpheme part of the sign and the bound morpheme part of the sign separately. They don't even though they're occurring simultaneously in time, someone watching sign language actually separates them out. Just like if I say, I'm going to go run to the store, I'm running to the store right now. I say running, and you, in your head, you know, okay, run, I know what run means, and then aim means it's happening right now. You separate those things out, so does someone listening, or I should say, watching as somebody signs. They will separate out the words, separate out the parts of it the same way. We see that when signers are watching other people talk, sometimes they will misremember what someone said with sign, and what they do when they misremember is they will accidentally form what we call illusory conjunctions. An illusory conjunction, so every sign, just like every phoneme, is a combination of features. So, is a combination of the bilabial place, and the voiceless manner, and the stop manner. Okay, so it's a combination of those features. Every sign in sign language is a combination of hand shape and movement and location and palm orientation. And when signers are watching people sign, if they misremember what someone said, often what happens is they misremember one of the features, and they replace it with a feature from another sign that was made in close proximity. So what that tells us is that as signers are watching, they're mentally breaking the signs apart into hand shape, location, movement, and palm orientation. Just like we're mentally separating out whether it's voiced or voiceless, what's the place of articulation, what's the manner of articulation. We separate out those characteristics. Signers separate out the parameters in their head and can mix them up. Just like we can mix up those voicing, place, and manner when we speak an oral language. We also see that when signers make speech errors, and they make speech errors just like people who use oral language make speech errors, they make those errors according to small parameters, just like we might make a stop instead of a fricative, or we might make something bilabial instead of alveolar, or something like that, because something close by was bilabial, and so we make something that should have been alveolar bilabial by accident. They'll do the same thing. So if they're making a sign that involves one hand shape, and it's supposed to have a different hand shape, they might actually use this hand shape instead. There's another sign close by that uses that hand shape. So their speech errors also reflect that in their mind, these different parameters are real. So in the way that they misperceive speech and the way they misproduce speech, we see that these parameters are real, just like we do with spoken language. We can show by having signers watch videos of different signs that when we show them videos, we can actually stop the videos at different points in time after having only shown them a few milliseconds, maybe 10 or 20 milliseconds of a sign, then maybe 10 or 20 milliseconds more, 10 or 20 milliseconds more, and we can ask them what they know about the sign at that point. And just like speakers of oral languages can figure out what word you're saying with just a tiny bit of information, not even the whole word, signers can figure out what sign someone's making by just using a little bit of information. But what we have learned from research like this is that they actually perceive some of the parameters faster than they perceive others. So the first thing that a signer will recognize when they look at somebody signing is the location of the sign. Okay, so that's the fastest. They'll be able to tell you very quickly where in the signing space the person is making the sign. That's the first thing they process. The next thing they process is the hand shape. So once their brain has decided where in space the sign is being made, the next thing they focus on is the hand shape, and they extract that information out. And then the last thing they focus on is the movement. So they pay attention to these in this order, and the less information you give them. So if you give them less information, they might miss the movement, but they'll get the hand shape and the location right. If you give them even less information, they might miss the movement and the hand shape, but they'll get the location right. And this is how signs are organized in their mental dictionary. So where you and I might organize our mental dictionary by what the first sound of a word is, signers will organize it first by location, and then break it down by hand shape, and then break it down by movement. So their dictionaries, their mental dictionaries, are organized according to these parameters. So you can ask them, tell me all the signs you know that are made in this part of space, and they'll just start doing them. Just like if I said, tell me all the words you know that begin with the letter A. You could do that, right? You could start coming up with words that you know that begin with A or A or E or something like that. They can do that. You can also, if I said, tell me words you know that rhyme with the word kick, and you would start thinking of different words you know. It's like asking them, tell me all the words you know that have this particular hand shape. And they'll just start cycling through them. But they have to go look them up. But they are organized that way so they can find them. We find that when signers experience brain damage, the parameter that's affected most often is hand shape. So I find this fascinating. There's a part of the brain, in the left hemisphere, that's located very close to the base of the motor cortex. It's called Broca's area. And Broca's area is responsible for helping us coordinate the articulators of speech. It helps us make sure that our jaw and our lips and our tongue and everything are all working as they're supposed to in order to produce the sounds we want to produce, in the order we want to produce them in. When that part of the brain is damaged, people have difficulty articulating clearly. So they might struggle to produce words at all. They might mispronounce words. They might struggle with particularly difficult articulations. And you'll see that people actually will engage in the kinds of phonological simplifications we see little children making because, for example, consonant clusters are really hard when you have damage to Broca's area. So people will drop sounds they don't need, but they'll keep stops because stops are easier. Right? So they'll do all the kinds of things that little kids do to make speech easier to produce. When someone who speaks American Sign Language, or any sign language, gets damage to Broca's area, they have the same problem, but it has to do with how their hands articulate. So they don't have any difficulty doing hand shapes or motions that aren't related to language. They can cook, they can do crafts, they can do any other thing that you would normally do with your hands, they can do without difficulty. But as soon as they start trying to talk, their hands don't want to make the shapes that they're supposed to, and they don't want to make the movements that they're supposed to. But it's only when they're talking, which tells you that that part of the brain is guiding those motions, but only in the context of speech, which is really cool. So you see really similar types of production problems in people who are using an oral language versus a manual language, even though the modality is completely different, because the brain doesn't care. The brain says, you're trying to talk. If you're trying to talk, Broca's area is going to help you coordinate those muscles. So if Broca's area gets damaged, then all of a sudden articulation becomes more difficult. And then the number one parameter that's affected is hand shape, just like the number one thing that gets affected for us is manner of articulation. We have a really hard time getting having enough fine motor control in order to make things like liquids and fricatives and things like that. So we do things like gliding and stopping just like little kids do. Now, in spoken language, we organize words that we know in terms of things that sound alike. So I can think of different words I know that begin with the R sound, or different words that I know that begin with, or that rhyme with each other. And we talk about these as phonological neighborhoods. These are words that sound alike and are connected by their similarity in sound. And we see similar kinds of phonological neighborhoods in the minds of people who sign. So there are some neighborhoods that are very dense. In other words, there are lots and lots of words that you know that meet that sound requirement. If I ask you all the words you know that begin with Z, there's not going to be very many. How many do you know? Zebra, xylophone, zip, zoo. Any more? Zing. How many Z words do you know? Not many, right? Z is a pretty small neighborhood. There aren't very many words in the Z neighborhood. Okay? But if I asked you how many words you know that begin with B? None? Let's go. Give me some B words. Ball, bat, boy, big, brother, ball, Boston. I mean, we can go on for an hour coming up with words that begin with B, right? So, and if we think about words that differ only in minor respects, like if I talk about things like pat, bat, hit, hat, cat, kit, you know, where they're just small changes that are changing the meaning of words, you can get some pretty dense neighborhoods of words that phonologically remind you of other words. It turns out that sign has the same thing. There are some hand shapes, some locations, some movements that have lots of signs associated with them, and some that have fewer. So in a very dense neighborhood, in a neighborhood that has lots and lots of members that all share a particular location. Okay, so these are all sounds that are all made in the same place in the signing space. If you have a lot of signs that are made in that same place, unfamiliar signs are harder to process because there's so many signs you know that are made in that space, it's hard for you to recognize signs that aren't very familiar because the very familiar ones keep trying to get triggered in your head. You keep wanting to see the signs that you know well and might miss little details that tell you the sign is a new word or something that you need to learn. You might misunderstand what the person said. In neighborhoods that are very dense because of hand shape, that having lots of words for some reason that have the same hand shape actually helps you process unfamiliar signs. And we don't understand why that's true. Clearly, the brain, usually when you have a really dense neighborhood, it makes it harder to recognize words in the neighborhood because you have so many words competing to be recognized based on the information you're receiving. And for some reason, hand shape is an unusual feature in that when there are very dense neighborhoods where lots and lots of signs are made that all share, that all have a particular hand shape, it makes it easier for people to process them. They're faster to process words that share a certain hand shape than they are other kinds of features. And we don't know why that is, but we're trying to understand what it is about hand shape, because hand shape functions like a feature. We recognize it categorically. It's one of the first things to be lost when they experience brain damage. It acts like articulation, like place and manner in many, many other respects. But in this particular case, it functions and it does this really weird thing. We don't understand why hand shape facilitates recognition in very dense neighborhoods.
Dr. Donald, I have a question. Location, was that back to the earlier video we were watching where it was the near, moderate, far?
So location has to do with where in your signing space. So your signing space goes from about here to about here. And if you choose to make this, you can make the signs close to your body.
Yeah.
You can make them out here. You can make them out here. You can make them up here. You can make them down here.
Okay.
Those are all location, and I can actually, just like I can distinguish phoneme by bilabial, alveolar, palatal, whatever, I can distinguish phonemes by where in space I am.
Got it. So it could be like moderate, but higher up.
Right, I could change it. Yeah, I might actually be turning something from a noun to a verb, or I might be changing it to, I might be changing its lexical category by moving where it is in space.
Okay.
And location also gets used in another interesting way in sign language. So in In spoken language, we will, we use pronouns a lot, right? Say in English. So I might say, so I went to the store with my daughter, and she and I were looking for some new hair color because she's tired of her hair being red. She wants to try something different. And every time I say she, you know I'm talking about her. Because I wouldn't refer to myself as she, right? I would use a different pronoun. I want to do something. I think she looks great with red hair, but she wants it to be a different color. So when I say I, you know I'm talking about me. When I say she, you know I'm talking about my daughter. In sign language, when you start off having a conversation, you don't have pronouns like he and she in that way, at least not in American Sign Language. What you'll do is you'll start off and say, okay, so I went to the store, and it was me and my daughter. And now what I've done is designate this space. This space is now my daughter. So when I talk to you, every time I want to refer to my daughter, I point at that space, and that means her, or she. So when you're talking to someone in American Sign Language, you have to not only pay attention to what they're doing, but you have to keep in mind what they told you about who's, and if you're talking about someone who's telling you about several different people all at once, they'll say, okay, so I went out shopping with my daughter and her 2 cousins. And then you have to pay attention when they're talking, because if I'm talking about the cousins, I point over here, you have to remember that that's what I'm talking about. But it sounds really, it's like, how can you remember to do that? Well, I want you to think, if I said, well, I went out shopping with my daughter, Maggie, and her cousins, Ethan and Sarah. Okay, well, now in your head you're going, okay, Maggie sounds like a girl's name, Ethan sounds like a boy's name, Sarah sounds like a girl's name. So now when I say she, you won't think of Ethan at all, right? We're used to remembering that kind of detail so that we can understand what someone is saying. We're just not used to having to think about it in terms of space. So they're just using a different technique so they're using location to actually give you pronoun information too, which is kind of interesting. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about acquisition. Oh, actually let's not, because it's 9:49. We'll start next time talking about sign language acquisition, and I will try to